When we chose the theme for this conference, and the steering committee chooses where the conference will be held and what the theme will be, our theme, beg your pardon, the theme that we chose was inclusion. And if we look at all the ways around the world in which people are excluded from democratic rights of protection, sexual orientation is a very important one. When I was Minister of Justice in Canada, in 1992, I brought in amendments to our Human Rights Act to make sexual orientation a prohibited ground of discrimination. And this was the act that governed the private sector. We had already decided that even though the courts had not ruled on the issue, that given other cases that they had decided where people were trying to expand the application of the non-discrimination clause in our Constitution, that probably sexual orientation would eventually be included. And so we, as a government, looked to eliminate discrimination based on sexual orientation in all areas of policy. And we even removed the discrimination against gays and lesbians serving in the armed forces. So these are, every generation there are different things that we see. We evolve in our thinking. So in Canada, legal barriers to homosexual acts had been removed in the late 1960s. What this meant was that gay and lesbian people could live more openly, could become more integrated into society, more visible. And that came to raise the level of awareness that there was discrimination and that there were ways in which they were not getting full democratic rights. So from countries like Canada, which were perhaps more advanced in these areas than others, comes the kind of movement more globally that gay and lesbian, whether gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender people, I use the whole acronym, need protection. And it is frightening. I come from a country where same-sex marriage is legal. And yet, in many African countries, homosexuality is a crime, and people are seriously penalized. So when we were talking about inclusion, if we are going to have a Congress that looks at social, political, and economic inclusion, that's clearly a category of people whose needs must be addressed in the context of democratic protections. There was a time when the advancement of women and many of the things that we think of as women's issues were very difficult to put on the agenda, where women's issues were seen as kind of not mainstream issues and not important issues that important people concerned themselves with. That's changed very much now, not only because of the legal protections of women, the protections of discrimination based on sex, but also because we know through our economic research, for example, that unless women are directly engaged in economic activity, unless their rights to participate in the economy are protected, that the well-being of countries, the material well-being, the economic well-being of countries suffers. And that also has an impact on families if women do not have the right to work, the ability to work, to be paid fairly, etc. But we've evolved. So maybe 30 or 40 years ago, it would have been harder to give the same kind of pride of place to women as a group who have been excluded and whose inclusion is really important. So our social attitudes change. Yeah. And we grow and develop, we learn. Science helps us to understand things. I don't think in my country any reasonable-minded person thinks, for example, that sexual orientation is something that we choose. It's clearly innate. We don't know exactly the combination of factors that creates it, whether it's purely genetic or to some degree have some other influences, prenatal influences. We don't know. All we know is it's not something that people choose. It's not something that people decide to do. I didn't choose to be heterosexual. I just am. I don't know how to describe it. Nobody taught me. Fortunately, it happened to be the dominant sexual orientation of my society, and I've never had to hide who I loved. I've never had to hide who I lusted after, or my youthful experiences of finding that. So when we understand that these are innate qualities, we know that people have to be allowed to express their humanity in terms of who they are, because we also have come to understand that these things don't hurt anybody. There was a time we thought, oh, this was going to undermine the family. Fiddle-dee-dee, it doesn't at all. So I guess when you say how did we come to choose this, it's because it is one of the fields, one of the areas of exclusion which we now recognize needs to be dealt with. And I think much of it comes from society. There's a kind of an interaction that sometimes society forces people in government to rethink issues, and they come to accept a new view and create new norms that not everybody in society agrees with, but those they move along as the new norms become the law and the standard. So it's a kind of an interaction between the social push and the government pull. But in a democracy, you have that opportunity to have that dialogue and debate. When I was Minister of Justice in the early 1990s, there was no push for gay marriage, for example, in Canada. Civil unions was the most that people wanted. I think that what was important then was with the AIDS epidemic that many partners of gay people who were suffering from AIDS found that they had no legal status, no right to help. They may have been with a partner for 20 years, but they had no right to make any medical decisions. There was no way their partnership could be respected in the law. And sort of right-thinking people could see how unfair that was and what kind of injustices that created. So sometimes you have events or things that trigger a kind of a development of thinking in the same way that, for example, during World War II, I mean, many women had to do things to step into jobs that men left. And that, after the war, people tried to push the women out of the labor force again to give the men the jobs. But they had in many ways established a whole new set of understandings of what women were capable of doing. So these events come along that change the way we think and give us new attitudes, and that then pushes for changes to protect human rights. To some degree, it's just human to be like that. And Canada is a wonderful country for the protection of human rights. But it doesn't mean we don't have areas where people are very conservative, very traditional in their thinking. It just depends often on how many people they meet. For example, I'm an urban person. I come from Vancouver, and I've lived in great cities. I now live in Paris and New York. But there are parts of the United States, for example, and parts of Canada, where the communities are small and where there isn't a lot of diversity. One of the great joys of living in a city is that you tend to meet lots of different kinds of people. I remember when I was a graduate student in London. London, this was in the early 1970s, and I mean, London was full of every kind of person, and I thought, it's impossible to be a freak in London. Because however peculiar you are, whatever strange ideas or habits you have, or way of dressing or being, there's somebody else just like you there. I mean, it's just a city just full of many different kinds of people. And when you live that way, you come to understand that these are your neighbors. Your sense of who is other, who is different, who doesn't belong, is very different. But if you live in a community, in a town or a village or a place where everybody is the same, ethnically they're all the same and they've been the same way for generations, and somebody different comes along, it's often much more difficult to get accepted. Sometimes one person can be accepted, or a small number, but if there's a group that come in, all of a sudden people feel that their culture is threatened. And there are people who distrust the cosmopolitan outlook, think that it's sort of a threat to their culture. But I think that it's a matter of education. And education isn't just going to school. Education is being curious. Education is being exposed to things that are different and new, and trying to understand them and learn about them. And that's really how we break down those barriers. But that's also part of what it means to be modern. I think if you say, what does it mean to be modern? Being modern means having an outlook that goes beyond a small community. And when political scientists and sociologists do indexes of the level of modernity in a society, one of the key indicators is the status of women, for example. Because in a traditional, non-modern society, women are often very constrained in what they can do. So all of this is part of how we expose ourselves to new and different ideas and try to use media, culture, writing, travel to open up people's minds to the possibilities that people can be not like them, but be very worthwhile members of the community.